Hi, my name is Cassian, and after 5 years with the woman I thought I'd marry, she looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't good enough. At first I thought I had misunderstood, that maybe she was angry or maybe she just said something cruel in the heat of the moment. But then I realized it wasn't just a bad night, it was who she had always been, the small criticisms, the way she slowly reshaped me into someone I didn't recognize, how her family never saw me as an equal, only as someone to be molded into their world. And just when I thought I had sacrificed enough to prove I belonged, I found out they had already picked my replacement. Months before our breakup. I was never supposed to be her husband. I was just someone to fill the space until something better came along. But was I really the one who wasn't worthy? Or had I just spent years convincing myself to stay in a life that was never meant for me? And if I had seen the signs earlier, would I have still ended up here? I still remember the day I proposed to Selene. The air was crisp, the lake's surface a perfect mirror reflecting the golden hues of the sunset. It had been just the two of us, standing on the dock where we had our first date. She had smiled, eyes shimmering, as I slipped the ring onto her finger. In that moment, I was certain that we were meant to be, certain that love like ours was enough. But certainty has a way of eroding over time, like waves wearing down the edges of a rock. At first, the changes were subtle, almost unnoticeable. A comment here, a suggestion there. That tie makes you look a little too casual for dinner with my parents. Maybe try the navy one instead? I'd shrugged it off, thinking she was just helping me refine my style. After all, Selene had an impeccable sense of fashion. Then came the adjustments to the way I spoke. You sound too direct sometimes. My family values poise. Just take a second before responding. Make sure you're saying it in a way they'll appreciate. Again, I thought nothing of it. Selene grew up in a different world, one where words were chosen with precision, where appearances meant everything. But the real shift happened the night I met her parents at an exclusive gala. The Draytons were everything I wasn't. Old money, generational success, effortless status. Richard Drayton was a towering figure, sharp-eyed and calculating, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. Eleanor, his wife, was the embodiment of sophistication, her voice soft, yet somehow commanding. When Richard shook my hand, his grip was firm, measured. "You're a lawyer, right? Corporate law, I assume?" His tone made it clear he expected that answer. I smiled, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to go the way he wanted. "Criminal defense, actually." His expression barely shifted, but something in his demeanor cooled, like a door quietly clicking shut. "Interesting. Quite a challenging field." Eleanor sipped her wine delicately, then offered her own carefully placed remark. "Do you ever consider moving into a more respectable legal practice? Criminal law can be so unpredictable." I felt a flicker of defensiveness rise in my chest, but quickly swallowed it. I knew better than to challenge them in their own domain. So instead, I laughed, brushing it off. It keeps life interesting. That was the first time I realized I wasn't just dating Selene. I was being measured, evaluated, and perhaps adjusted to fit. From that night on, I started making small changes. I bought suits that matched the polished, understated elegance of the Draytons. I paid closer attention to my posture, my wording, my demeanor. I even started considering whether I should transition into corporate law, just hypothetically, just to see if it made sense. Ronan, my best friend, noticed before I did. One night, as we sat at our usual bar, he studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. "Man, you're not yourself lately." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" He took a sip of his drink before answering. "You're second-guessing everything. You used to walk into a room and own it. Now, it's like you're waiting for permission to exist." I chuckled, brushing off his concern. "Come on, Ro. Love is about compromise, right?" "Compromise is one thing. Losing yourself is another." I waved him off, unwilling to entertain the thought. Selene loved me, didn't she? She just wanted what was best for us, didn't she? But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing. One evening, as I was adjusting my tie in the mirror, Selene walked into the room. She tilted her head, studying me with the same sharp gaze her mother had. "You know," she said lightly, running a hand down my arm, "if you just refined yourself a little, my father would see how capable you really are." The words landed like a quiet strike, knocking something loose inside me. I hesitated before answering. You don't think he sees me as capable now? She laughed softly, shaking her head. You always take things so personally. I just mean, I want what's best for us. That's all. I nodded, smiling back at her. But as she walked away, something in my reflection caught my eye. The man staring back at me looked unfamiliar. The way he stood, the way he carried himself, even the slight hesitation in his expression. It wasn't the man I had been 5 years ago. I swallowed hard, forcing the thought away. Maybe she was right. Maybe I did need to be better. I adjusted my collar, smoothing out the fabric as if fixing my appearance could somehow silence the unease stirring in my chest. The reflection staring back at me was unfamiliar, but I shoved the thought aside, convincing myself it was just nerves. Growth required change, didn't it? And love, real love, required effort. Celine's voice called from the other room, pulling me from my thoughts. Are you ready? We don't want to be late. I exhaled and stepped into the hallway, forcing a smile. Yeah, let's go. The evening was another gathering, one of many, where I would stand beside Celine and measure every word before speaking. I had started to notice the way my sentences shortened around her friends, the way I hesitated before making a joke, scanning the room for her reaction. If she smiled, I relaxed. If she pursed her lips slightly or gave me that look, just a subtle tilt of her head, I knew I had said the wrong thing. I wasn't sure when it started, but somewhere along the way, I had learned to anticipate correction. Tonight's dinner was no different. The setting was immaculate, a rooftop lounge overlooking the city skyline, with soft lighting and expensive wine that tasted sharp against my tongue. Celine had prepped me on the way over. Let's try to keep things light tonight. My colleagues, they're not really interested in courtroom drama. I had nodded, knowing what she meant. Don't talk about your work. At the table, I played my part. I listened, I smiled, I nodded at all the right moments. But at some point, a conversation about ethics in business turned toward legal cases, and instinct took over. Actually, I said, leaning forward slightly, there's an interesting precedent from a case I worked on last year. Celine's fingers lightly touched my arm. What Cassian means is that he's always admired how corporate firms handle negotiations. Her tone was smooth, effortless, as if she were translating my words into something more palatable. I swallowed my next sentence. The conversation moved on without me. I barely touched my food for the rest of the night. When we got home, I placed my keys on the counter, my movement slower than usual. I waited for Selene to say something, anything about what happened at dinner. Instead, she hummed to herself as she kicked off her heels, completely at ease. Finally, I spoke. Did you think I was going to say something wrong? She turned to me, surprised. What? At dinner, when you cut me off. Her expression softened, her head tilting just slightly, just like she did when I didn't quite understand something. Cass, I was just helping you. That discussion wasn't the right place for a courtroom anecdote. I didn't want you to feel out of place. I let out a breath, forcing a laugh. Right, You always take things so personally, she said, smiling as she reached for my hand. I just want us to be our best, that's all. There it was again, that word, best. I squeezed her fingers, nodding as if I believed it. But later that night, as I lay awake, I replayed the dinner in my head. Why did I feel like a child being corrected in front of strangers? Why did it bother me so much? The next day, Celine brought up something new. I was thinking, she started as she scrolled through her phone. Corporate law has so much more stability than defense work. Have you ever considered it? I laughed. Number? I like what I do. She nodded, tucking her hair behind her ear. Of course. I know how stressful it can be for you. Wouldn't it be nice to have something a little more structured, a career with more room to... Celine. My tone was firmer than I expected. I like what I do. She smiled, but there was something else behind her expression. A quiet patience, like she was waiting for me to come to the right conclusion on my own. That night, I met Ronan for drinks. You're overthinking it, I told him after explaining the conversation. He stirred his whiskey with a slow turn of his wrist. Am I? I exhaled, already bracing for whatever he was about to say. Cass, man, listen to yourself. She's not suggesting things. She's conditioning you. I scoffed. She's just trying to help me. No, she's molding you. He leaned forward. You said she corrects you in conversations now. She tells you what to wear. Now she's steering your career. Do you even hear yourself? I rolled my eyes, shaking my head. It's not like that. Ronan sighed. Look, I'm just saying, Celine doesn't want you. She wants an upgraded version of you. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got caught somewhere in my throat. Later that night, as I sat on the couch with my laptop open, I typed in a search I never thought I would. Top corporate law firms hiring in the city. It was just a curiosity, just seeing what was out there. When I casually mentioned it to Celine, her entire face lit up. She wrapped her arms around my neck, pressing a kiss to my cheek. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. The warmth of her approval settled deep in my chest, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't my choice anymore. The next morning, I stepped into the office of my new firm, dressed in a tailored suit that felt stiff against my skin. The lobby gleamed with modern luxury, marble floors, polished wood paneling, and an air of quiet power that made every footstep sound important. Celine had kissed me goodbye that morning, a radiant smile on her lips. You're going to be incredible, she'd whispered, adjusting my tie with practiced ease. I should have felt excited. Instead, I felt like I was walking into a role someone else had cast me in. By the end of my first week, I had met the partners, shaken the right hands, and mastered the art of nodding along in meetings. Celine was thrilled. She had introduced me to her colleagues at a networking event, gripping my arm as she beamed. This is Cassian, my fiancé, the future top corporate lawyer. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I smiled, but a thought lingered. Would she have said it with the same pride if I were still a defense attorney? A few days later, an unexpected invitation arrived. Richard Drayton wanted to take me golfing. It was phrased as a friendly outing, but I knew better. In his world, nothing was ever just casual. The course was a pristine stretch of green, private and untouched by the outside world. The caddies moved in silence, and even the wind seemed to carry an air of quiet exclusivity. Richard was already waiting for me at the first hole, dressed in crisp golfing attire, exuding the same effortless confidence he always did. Good to see you settling in, Cassian, he said as he handed me a club. How's the new job? I adjusted my grip, choosing my words carefully. It's an adjustment, but I'm learning a lot. He gave a slow nod. That's the right attitude. Adaptation is key. We played in near silence for the first few holes. Every movement, every glance, felt like an unspoken evaluation. Then, over drinks at the clubhouse, he finally spoke what had been lingering in the air. You're adapting well, he said, swirling his glass of bourbon. But let's be honest, our world is different from yours. The statement was so casual, so effortless, that it almost slipped past me. I took a measured sip of my drink. Meaning? Richard leaned back, his gaze sharp but unreadable. You're smart, Cassian. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. But men like you have to work twice as hard to belong in circles like these. That's just reality. The words settled heavily between us. I forced a small smile. And here I thought success was just about ability. He chuckled, shaking his head. Ability opens the door, but fitting in? That's what keeps you inside. I should have expected this. Richard wasn't warning me. He was reminding me. No matter how well I played my role, I was still an outsider looking in. The realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly, sinking into the spaces between my thoughts. That night, I brought it up to Celine. Do you think your family really approves of me? She barely looked up from her laptop. Of course they do. I hesitated. Are you sure? Or are they just waiting for me to prove myself? She sighed, closing her screen. Cass, you're already proving yourself. They'll come around. She said it so easily, like it was just another step in the process. Like it was normal. Like I was something to be evaluated. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. Later that night, Celine fell asleep beside me, peaceful, content. I, on the other hand, lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Richard's words echoing in my head. What if I was never meant to belong? The next morning, I arrived at my office to find an email flagged as high priority. My stomach tightened as I clicked it open. Congratulations, Cassian. We are pleased to offer you the position of senior associate. This promotion includes a substantial salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and access to our exclusive partner mentorship program. It was a massive jump. Promotions like this didn't happen in a matter of months. They took years. Yet here it was, sitting in my inbox, waiting for my acceptance. I barely had time to process it before my phone buzzed. Celine? She didn't bother with a hello. Did you see the email? I hesitated. Yeah, I knew my father would help guide you in the right direction, she said, her voice light, effortless. This is incredible, Cassian. It's exactly what you deserve. Something about the way she said it made my throat tighten. Not, I'm so proud of you. Not, you earned this. But I knew my father would help. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The weight of her words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. Celine, I said slowly, did Richard? Of course he did, she cut in, like it was obvious. You think promotions like this happen on their own? She let out a soft laugh. Cass, my family makes things happen. The realization hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't about merit. This wasn't about skill. This was Richard Drayton pulling strings. I was being handed success on a silver platter, but only if I played by their rules. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions, responding to emails, attending meetings, but the offer sat in my inbox like a loaded gun. That evening, I met Ronan at our usual bar. He took one look at me and let out a low whistle. That bad, huh? I slid my phone across the table, the promotion email still open. He read it, his brows pulling together. Damn, that's fast. I exhaled sharply. Yeah. Ronan took a sip of his drink before leaning in. All right, man, be straight with me. Did you earn this? I opened my mouth, then shut it. He let out a dry laugh. That's what I thought. He tapped the screen. This isn't a reward, Cass. It's a leash. I clenched my jaw. It's an opportunity. It's a cage. I shook my head. Celine's just trying to help me succeed. Ronan leaned back, studying me. You really believe that? I swallowed. I wanted to. But the truth was starting to scrape against the edges of my carefully built reality. The next day, Richard invited me for a drink, just the two of us. We sat in a sleek private lounge, the kind of place where business deals were made with a handshake and a knowing nod. You're adapting well, Richard said, swirling his bourbon. The firm is lucky to have you. I forced a polite smile. I appreciate that. He set his glass down. Men who know their place in the hierarchy tend to go far. There it was, the real message. I leaned forward slightly. And where exactly is my place? Richard smiled, calm, measured, in control. You're smart, Cassian. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. But in our world, loyalty matters more than ambition. The right connections can elevate you, or bury you. I took a slow sip of my drink, keeping my expression neutral. And you're offering elevation? Richard held my gaze. I'm offering you a path. A path. Not a choice. As I walked out of the lounge, my hands clenched into fists. I had spent my entire life building my career through grit and determination. But now I was a pawn in a game I never agreed to play. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the contract for my promotion. At the bottom of the page was Richard Drayton's signature, his approval stamped onto my future. For the first time, it wasn't ambition that kept me up at night. It was the sinking realization that this promotion wasn't mine, and if I signed it, neither was my life. The next morning, my phone buzzed just as I stepped into my office. The number flashing on the screen belonged to one of the senior partners, someone who rarely made personal calls. Cassian, his voice was smooth, practiced. I've been watching your work. Impressive, really. We need more people like you, sharp, adaptable, willing to grow. Something about the way he said it made my shoulders tense. I appreciate that, I said carefully, sinking into my chair. We've been discussing an opportunity, he continued, a senior role opening up at our London branch. It's a rare chance, fast-tracked to partner within a few years. I sat up straighter. Partner. That wasn't just a promotion. That was a future. Stability, wealth, power. Then I heard the words that changed everything. Richard Drayton spoke highly of you. The air in the room seemed to shift. Richard, I repeated. Yes, he mentioned you as someone with great potential. The partner chuckled. Of course, these decisions aren't made lightly, but having the right backing, well, it never hurts. I gripped the phone tighter. This wasn't just an opportunity. This was Richard's next move. After the call, I barely touched my coffee. My mind raced through possibilities, but the pattern was becoming painfully clear. First, the sudden promotion. Now, an international relocation. That evening, Richard extended an invitation for dinner, just the two of us. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where power brokers whispered behind thick tablecloths and deals were made over expensive wine. Richard sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "Have you ever considered expanding your career internationally?" he asked, casually swirling his glass. I leaned back in my chair. "Funny you ask. Got a call today about a position in London." Richard gave a small, satisfied nod. "A remarkable opportunity." I studied him. I'm guessing this wasn't just luck. He took his time before responding. Men who recognize opportunities when they come tend to do well in life. And there it was, the offer behind the offer. I set my glass down. "And what if I say no?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. There are always options for men who know when to take them. The message was clear. Take the job, leave this world behind, walk away from Celine. The choice had been laid before me like a high-stakes game of chess. But I wasn't the one making the moves. Later that night, I confronted Celine. I expected outrage. I expected disbelief. What I didn't expect was calm acceptance. "My father is just looking out for you," she said, sitting cross-legged on the couch. "It's not a bribe, Cassian. It's an opportunity." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how insane that sounded. "Celine, he's trying to get rid of me." She shook her head. "No, he's trying to place you where you belong." I let out a sharp breath. "So what? If I take this job, I earn my place, and if I don't." Her silence told me everything. I had spent 5 years believing we were in this together. That love, our love, was the foundation holding us up. But it had never been love. It had been an investment. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the relocation contract. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had never dared to before. Was I ever really a choice for her? Or was I just a project? The answer was starting to become painfully clear. I didn't reject the offer, but I didn't accept it either. Instead, I did something I had never considered before. I asked myself, if I walk away now, what exactly am I losing? The longer I sat there, the harder it was to find an answer. I placed the contract on the table, staring at it under the dim light. Whatever I decided next, it would change everything. I didn't make a decision that night. Instead, I shoved the contract into a drawer and convinced myself I had time. Time to think, time to weigh my options, time to figure out what I actually wanted. But time wasn't something the Draytons ever gave freely. When I arrived at work the next morning, something felt off. The usual nods from colleagues were missing, replaced by sidelong glances and hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by. I barely had time to settle at my desk before my assistant approached. "The partners want to see you." A meeting first thing in the morning? That wasn't normal. Inside the conference room, 3 senior partners sat across from me, their expressions unreadable. "Have a seat, Cassian," one of them said, gesturing to the chair in front of them. I did. My pulse was steady, but something deep in my gut churned. "As you know," the partner continued, "you were assigned the Wilkinson case last month. However, due to some internal restructuring, that case has been reallocated." I frowned. "Reallocated?" One of the others cleared his throat. "The decision was made at a higher level. We felt it would be more appropriate for someone else to handle it." I straightened. "I've already prepped for the trial. I've built relationships with the client. Why would you pull me off now?" They exchanged glances. The first partner sighed. "Cassian, I'm sure you understand that sometimes. Sometimes people in high places don't want certain people in the picture." The voice didn't belong to the partners. It came from behind me. I turned to see Michael Harrington, one of the firm's more seasoned attorneys, standing near the window, arms crossed. The partners didn't correct him. They didn't need to. I sat back, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't office politics. This was Richard Drayton. The meeting ended quickly after that, their words polite but empty. No real explanations, no room for argument. By the time I left the room, I wasn't just furious. I was done pretending this was normal. That night, I walked into the apartment, tension simmering just beneath my skin. Celine was on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely at ease. She barely glanced up. "How was your day?" I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. "You tell me." Her brows knit together. "What's that supposed to mean?" I tossed my briefcase onto the counter. "The Wilkinson case. It's gone. Want to guess who made that happen?" She sighed, setting her phone down like I was being dramatic. "Cass, my father only wants what's best for us. This is just his way of making sure you don't waste time on the wrong opportunities." Something inside me cracked. "So now he gets to decide what's best for me? For us?" She blinked, as if I was speaking a different language. "You're being emotional. This is how success works, Cassian. Connections matter." "Connections?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what we are? A connection? A project?" Celine exhaled, as if this was exhausting for her. "Cass, you're taking this too personally." For years, I had convinced myself that her silence meant she didn't know, that she wasn't part of the manipulation, just another player in a game she wasn't fully aware of. But tonight, as she sat there, calm, unfazed, unwilling to fight for me, I realized something. She had never been on my side. I walked out. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew where I wasn't staying. Ronan met me at our usual bar, a knowing look already on his face. "Talk to me," he said, sliding a whiskey toward me. I took a long sip before setting the glass down. "They pulled me off a case today. No explanation, just gone." Ronan tilted his head. "Richard?" I nodded. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Cass, you're in too deep. This isn't just about you and Selene anymore. This is a power play, and you're losing." I clenched my jaw. "So what? I just walk away?" Ronan studied me for a long moment before leaning forward. "Be honest with yourself. If she wasn't beautiful, if she wasn't connected, would you still be here?" The question landed harder than I expected. I didn't answer, because for the first time, I wasn't sure I liked the truth. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, the gaslighting, the expectations, the bribe, the sabotage. I thought I had been choosing Selene, but maybe the choice was never mine to begin with. When I finally fell asleep, my mind was clear for the first time in years. Tomorrow, I wouldn't wake up thinking about how to make Selene happy. I'd wake up thinking about how to take back control. I woke up feeling different, lighter maybe, not free, not yet, but something close. For the first time in years, my first thought wasn't about Selene, or her approval, or how to fit into a world that clearly didn't want me. It was about me. By the time I walked into my office, I had a plan. I wasn't going to roll over and accept Richard Drayton's silent exile. I would reclaim my ground. But before I could even sit at my desk, my assistant Julia hesitated at the doorway. "Mr. Calloway wants to see you," she said carefully. I frowned. The managing partner? Meetings with him were never casual. Inside, Calloway leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Cassian, close the door." I did. He let out a long breath before speaking. "I wanted to give you a heads up. Some concerns have been raised about your reputation." I stared at him. "Concerns?" He nodded. "A few clients have expressed hesitation about continuing with you on their cases." I forced a small laugh. "That's interesting because none of my clients have said a word to me." Calloway didn't answer right away. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't coming from inside the firm, but external pressures are real, Cassian. You understand that." My blood ran cold. I understood exactly what that meant. Richard had escalated. This wasn't just about influencing me anymore. He was turning the entire legal community against me. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to get them. At lunch, I met up with Daniel Mercer, a colleague I had known since law school. He owed me a few favors. At first, he was hesitant, stirring his drink without meeting my eyes. "Cass, I don't want to get involved." "You already are involved," I said. "Just tell me what's being said." Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Word around the firm is that you're being transitioned out." I leaned forward. "By who?" He hesitated. "Richard Drayton has been making calls, the kind that make people listen." I let out a slow breath. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't an overreaction. This was exile, and it was working. That night, I drove straight to the Drayton estate. I didn't call, I didn't ask, I demanded. When I arrived, the butler hesitated at the door. "Mr. Drayton is unavailable." "I'm not here for an appointment," I said flatly. The butler disappeared, and moments later, Eleanor Drayton appeared. She stood in the grand entryway, poised, perfectly composed, as if this was all going according to plan. "Cassian," she greeted smoothly. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" I didn't sit. I didn't offer pleasantries. "Tell me the truth. Are you trying to erase me?" She gave a small, knowing smile. "No one is erasing you, dear. We are simply redirecting you." I clenched my fists. "You're forcing me out of my own life." Eleanor tilted her head, as if amused by my defiance. "Cassian, you need to let her go." I exhaled sharply. "Celine is a grown woman. If she wanted me gone, she could tell me herself." Eleanor's expression didn't waver. "We are only trying to make this easier for you. If you don't leave now, you won't have a choice later." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a request anymore. They were erasing me, piece by piece, call by call, until there was nothing left. I turned and walked out. But I wasn't running. I was preparing. By the time I got home, my pulse was steady. Celine sat on the couch, calm, as if she already knew where I had been. I stood in the doorway, studying her. "You knew?" She didn't even flinch. "My family is only doing what they think is best." I waited. I waited for anything. A flicker of regret. A sign that she wasn't okay with this. But there was nothing. That's when I knew. She wasn't resisting. She was letting it happen. I turned to leave. "Cass," she called. I paused. Her voice was soft, careful. "Just take the London offer. Move forward." I looked at her one last time, not as the woman I had loved, but as a stranger who had once worn her face. I walked out, and this time I didn't look back. That night, I picked up my phone and dialed Ronan. "I need your help," I said. His response was instant. "Tell me what you need." I stared out at the city, a slow fire building in my chest. "It's time I stop playing their game," I said, "and start playing my own." By the time I stepped out of Ronan's car, the city was already settling into its late-night quiet. The air was crisp, the streets mostly empty, and for the first time in a long time, my mind felt sharp, focused. Ronan and I had spent the last few hours going over my next steps. We weren't just talking about damage control anymore. We were talking about strategy, about taking back what was mine, about making sure the Draytons didn't get the final say in my future. But as I walked up to my apartment door, something made me stop. A package sat on my doorstep. It was wrapped neatly in expensive black paper, tied with a silver ribbon, her style through and through. I didn't need to check the handwriting on the small card attached to know who it was from. Celine. I exhaled slowly, picked it up, and carried it inside. The weight of it was familiar. The kind of weight that told me before I even opened it that this wasn't just a gift, it was a message. Inside, folded with meticulous care, was a silk tie. Navy, patterned subtly with interwoven silver lines. I recognized it instantly. Months ago, we had been out shopping when I saw it in a display window. I had made an offhand comment about how sharp it looked, how it was exactly the kind of tie you'd see on a CEO in a boardroom. I never bought it, but now, here it was. Resting on top was a small note, written in that effortlessly elegant script of hers. "I thought this would suit you now. Celine." I gripped the note, my jaw tightening. This wasn't an apology. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a statement. She still saw me as hers. Even after everything, even after her family had tried to erase me, she still believed she controlled the narrative. Ronan picked up on it immediately when I showed him the tie over drinks later that night. "She's testing you," he said, unimpressed, "seeing if you'll crawl back." I turned the tie over in my hands, running my thumb along the smooth fabric. Maybe she's trying to remind me that she still knows me better than anyone. Ronan let out a sharp laugh. "No, man, she knows who you used to be. That's not the same thing." I looked down at the note again. "I thought this would suit you now." Was it just another move on the chessboard? Another way to pull me back in? Or was there a part of her that regretted any of this? I stared at the phone in my hand, Celine's contact still in my favorites, right where it had always been. Before I could stop myself, I tapped her name. The line barely rang once before she answered. Cassian, just my name. Soft, familiar. A part of me, the part that had spent years loving her, wanted to respond, wanted to ask why. But then, just as quickly, I remembered. Richard's threats, Eleanor's warnings, the way Selene never fought back when they tried to erase me. And I knew. I didn't owe her an explanation. Without a word, I ended the call. Then I did something I should have done long ago. I dropped the silk tie into the trash. I pulled up Selene's contact one last time, and I blocked her number. She may think she still owns me, but I was about to prove her dead wrong. As I powered off my phone, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in years, there was silence. But in that silence, one thought lingered. Would she let me go that easily? I woke up the next morning to an unfamiliar feeling, clarity. Selene was out of my life, her calls blocked, her grip loosening. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. But peace, I was learning, was never something the Draytons allowed. That evening I met Ronan at our usual bar, determined to focus on what came next. "All right," I said, dropping into the chair across from him. "I've got a plan." But instead of his usual smirk, Ronan just sat there, swirling his drink. His shoulders were tense, his expression unreadable. Something was wrong. I narrowed my eyes. "What is it?" Ronan sighed, setting his glass down. "I got a call today. Someone you're not gonna like." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Let me guess. Selene?" Ronan hesitated. Then he nodded. I let out a sharp breath, already bracing for whatever she'd spun. "She said she was concerned about you," Ronan said carefully, "that you were making rash decisions, pushing people away who were just trying to help." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "Right, because that's what she does best. It plays the concerned fiancé while she burns everything to the ground." Ronan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his drink, turning the glass between his fingers. That's when I realized she had gotten to him. My chest tightened. "Please tell me you don't believe her." Ronan exhaled. "Cass, I'm not saying she's right, but..." He rubbed a hand over his face. "What if you are letting your pride get in the way? What if you're making this worse for yourself?" I felt the familiar anger start to rise, but I forced it down. "She's manipulating you, Ronan, the same way she's manipulated me for years." But he was already shaking his head. "All I'm saying is, maybe you should talk to her before burning everything down." I scoffed. "You sound just like her." That hit hard. I saw the flicker of irritation in his eyes before he stood, tossing cash onto the bar counter. "Do whatever you want, man," he muttered, "but I've known you a long time, and I've never seen you like this." I watched him walk out, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. This is how she works. She isolates, controls, turns the people closest to you into weapons. She had done it before, slowly, methodically, cutting me off from old friends, from anyone who might make me question her version of the truth. And now she was doing it again. Except this time, I saw it coming. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war, and if she was going to play dirty, then so would I. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I landed on a name I hadn't called in years. A fixer, someone who specialized in digging up dirt. I pressed dial. The line rang once, twice. Then a low voice answered, "What do you need?" I leaned back in my chair, my grip tightening around the phone. "I need dirt on the Draytons," I said. "All of them." The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email notification. No sender, no name. Just a subject line that made my stomach drop. "You should know the truth." For a moment, I just stared at it. Then, with a slow exhale, I tapped the screen. Inside was a single link. I hesitated. My instincts screamed trap, but I clicked it anyway. It led to an article from months ago, an online feature covering a high-profile charity gala. My gaze skimmed past the headline before landing on the accompanying photo, and my blood ran cold. Drayton family welcomes new investor into their circle. There, standing beside Richard and Eleanor Drayton, smiling like he belonged, was Selene. And next to her, a man I didn't recognize, sharp suit, perfect posture, clean cut, polished, approved. The caption beneath the image read, "Vivian Alden, heir to Alden Real Estate Group, joins Drayton Investments as a strategic partner." I clenched my jaw. The timestamp on the article? 3 months before our breakup. I scrolled further, my mind racing. Had Selene known? Had her family set this up behind her back? Or was she in on it the whole time? I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. An hour later, I was sitting across from an old contact in the media industry, an investigative journalist named Sam. He leaned back, scrolling through his laptop, eyebrows furrowed. Yeah, I remember hearing whispers about this guy. The Aldens and the Draytons have been circling each other for a while. Business reasons, power reasons. I crossed my arms. How long has he been around? Sam clicked through more files before landing on another article. Almost a year. He's been at private fundraisers, exclusive events. Hell, Richard Drayton even personally introduced him at some of them. My fingers curled into fists. They had been phasing me out before I even knew the game was over. My breath came out slow and measured. And Selene? Sam hesitated. All I can say is, she never looked forced. I swallowed hard. This wasn't a last-minute betrayal. It was a transition plan. And I had been the prototype, one they eventually deemed unfit for their brand. I stormed into Celine's office that afternoon, without an appointment, without knocking. She barely looked up from her laptop. Cassian, whatever this is. I threw my phone onto her desk, the article glaring from the screen. Her eyes flicked down. She didn't even flinch. How long? My voice was tight, controlled. How long before I was officially replaced? A flicker of something passed through her expression. Guilt, maybe, but she masked it quickly with cold indifference. Cassian, don't be dramatic, she sighed, sitting back in her chair. You and I were always going in different directions. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. So, you were just waiting for the perfect moment to drop me? Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to argue. But then, in that infuriatingly calm way of hers, she simply said, It wasn't personal. I stiffened. My family needed someone who fit their future plans, she continued smoothly. You resisted too much. Resisted, like I was an obstacle, like I was a mistake they had to correct. My fists tightened at my sides. You didn't just leave me, Selene. You erased me. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in her expression again. Something almost human. But then it was gone. You should move on, Cassian, she said. Like I did. I exhaled slowly, forcing the rage back down, locking it away. Because now I knew exactly what I was up against. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out, I paused just long enough to glance back. And then, in a voice just loud enough for her to hear, I said, I hope your new fiancé knows he's just another chess piece. Then I walked out, and this time, I wasn't walking away. I was preparing for war. The city moved around me, but I felt detached from it. I sat in a quiet cafe downtown, my fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The confrontation with Selene replayed in my head like a broken record. Every word, every flicker of indifference in her expression. It wasn't personal, like I had just been a stepping stone, someone to pass the time with until they found the right replacement. I had been pushed aside, erased, but I wasn't done yet. My phone buzzed against the table, snapping me from my thoughts. A text from Sam. I dug a little deeper. You need to see this. Attached was a blurry image, a grainy paparazzi shot from 6 months ago. 2 figures, close, too close. Selene and Vivian Alden. I zoomed in, my stomach twisting into knots. Her hand was on his arm. His head was tilted toward hers in a way that didn't belong to strangers. The time stamp? 2 months before she ended things with me. I stared at the image, my pulse thrumming in my ears. That weekend, I remembered it. Selene had told me she was working late on a campaign, that she was under pressure, that she just needed space to focus. And I had believed her. How many other lies had I swallowed without question? I scrolled further, skimming through the text below the image. Multiple sources reported seeing them together at private events, late-night dinners, hotel lounges. I exhaled sharply, pressing the phone to my forehead. This wasn't just about replacing me. She had been keeping her options open the entire time. You're too quiet, Ronan said later that night, setting down his beer. I had called him to meet, but I barely touched my drink. I could still feel the heat of my phone in my pocket, the weight of that damn picture burning into me. I looked up at him. She was already seeing him. His expression darkened. Before you broke up? I nodded. Ronan exhaled through his nose. Jesus, man. I let out a humorless laugh. You know the worst part? I don't even think she sees it as cheating. In her mind, it was just a transition. Because people like her don't end things until they have something better lined up. I stared at my untouched drink. She thinks she can rewrite history, act like I never existed, like she never lied, never manipulated, never. I clenched my jaw. Ronan leaned forward, his gaze sharp. So what are you going to do? I took a slow breath, my grip tightening around the glass. Then I smirked. She plays her games in the shadows, I said. It's time I drag her into the light. I spent the next few hours digging, every financial record, every transaction tied to Celine and Vivienne, every event they had attended together while she was still with me. Piece by piece, I built my case. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cause a scene. I was going to expose her. I pulled up my email, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I attached the incriminating photos, the timeline, the evidence that proved what she had done. Then, with a steady hand, I typed in the recipient's address. Not to Celine, not to Vivienne, but to someone who would make sure the world saw. I hovered over the send button, inhaled deeply, and clicked. Message sent. I leaned back in my chair, watching the notification disappear. Then I whispered, just to myself, checkmate. The morning after I sent the email, I expected chaos. I expected backlash. What I didn't expect was a dinner invitation. The email arrived in my inbox just after noon. From Eleanor Drayton. Subject, a civilized goodbye. Cassian, let's end things on a civilized note. Join us for dinner this Friday. No tension, no hostility, just a farewell among adults. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. Ronan whistled low when I showed him. You know this is a setup, right? Of course it is. I leaned back in my chair, smirking. But they don't realize I'm not walking in unarmed. Ronan shook his head. Just promise me one thing. What's that? That you'll make them regret inviting you. I chuckled. Oh, that's a given. When Friday arrived, I drove up to the Drayton estate for what I knew would be my last dinner there. I stepped out of my car, straightened my jacket, and took a slow breath. The air was thick with tension. The front doors opened before I could knock. A butler, one I didn't recognize, gestured me inside. The dining room was exactly as I remembered. Crystal glasses, perfectly arranged silverware. The weight of a room designed to intimidate. Seated at the long, gleaming table were Richard, Eleanor, Celine, and Vivienne. A full house. Celine met my eyes but gave nothing away. Vivienne smirked, lounging in his chair like he belonged there. I pulled out my seat but didn't sit. Quite the guest list. Eleanor sipped her wine. We thought it was only fair for everyone to have a chance to move forward. Move forward. I smiled coldly. How thoughtful. The meal started off with forced politeness, but it wasn't long before Richard started. I hear you've been making moves lately, he said, swirling his whiskey. I hope you understand that holding on to the past only makes things harder. Eleanor nodded. You always had potential, Cassian, but you never quite fit in, did you? Vivienne laughed softly. It must be exhausting, trying to prove you belong. I tilted my head, scanning their faces. They weren't just trying to dismiss me. They were trying to break me. I exhaled slowly and leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. You know, I said casually, for a family that claims to have everything, you sure spend a lot of time worrying about me. Richard's grip on his glass tightened. Celine's expression didn't flicker. Vivienne raised an eyebrow, amused. Is that the best you've got? I smiled. Not even close. Then I slid my phone across the table. The screen was already lit, displaying the pictures of Celine and Vivienne. Eleanor's face paled. Richard's fork scraped against his plate. Celine finally looked shaken. You wouldn't dare, I smirked. I already have. Silence crashed over the table. Then Richard turned to Celine, his voice low. How long have you known? Celine stiffened, refusing to answer. Vivienne sat back, his smirk slipping. This is pathetic. I stood, adjusting my suit jacket. You know what's pathetic? The fact that you think you're the next king in their little dynasty. I met Celine's gaze one last time. We both know how this ends. Then I turned to Vivienne. Watch your back. And with that, I walked out. Behind me, I could hear voices rising, panic sinking in. But I didn't look back, not anymore. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. "You think you've won? This isn't over." I exhaled, a slow smile curling my lips. I never expected it to be over. The real fight was just beginning. I stared at the message on my screen, the words glowing against the darkness. "You think you've won? This isn't over." I tightened my grip on my phone, exhaling slowly. Good. I wasn't looking for a clean break anymore. This wasn't about escaping their control. It was about burning down everything they built. The next morning, my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in years. I answered. "Cassian," a voice said. "It's Dean. You need to come by my office. There's something you should see." Dean was an old colleague from my criminal defense days, one of the few people I still trusted in the legal world. "What is it?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. A pause, then, in a quieter voice. "It's about Cellini's family." Dean slid a thick folder across his desk the moment I walked in. The gold and Drayton legal insignia was stamped across the front. My gut twisted as I flipped open the file. Inside were neatly typed pages, dense with legal jargon, but the meaning was clear, a prenuptial agreement. My eyes scanned the first few paragraphs, and then I found it, the clause that made my stomach drop. If I had married Celine, I would have had no legal control over any financial decisions. Not just marital assets, but everything. The house, the investments, future business endeavors. If I had ever left her, if she had left me, there were clauses in place that would have ruined my career. A slow wave of fury burned through me. "This wasn't a relationship," I muttered. "It was a contract, a damn acquisition." Dean let out a low breath. "It gets worse." I looked up sharply. Dean tapped one of the last pages. This wasn't just a hypothetical draft. This was supposed to be signed before the wedding. My pulse pounded in my ears. "If you had gone through with it," Dean continued, "they would have owned you." The air in the office felt suffocating. I had been a fool, a blind, willing pawn in their game, and they thought they could just erase me. I let out a slow, measured breath. Then I closed the file. "Thanks, Dean." His gaze was steady. "What are you going to do?" I met his eyes. "End this." That night, I stormed into Celine's office, slamming the file onto her desk. She barely flinched. Instead, she simply glanced at it, then back up at me. "You're really making a habit of barging in, aren't you?" "Explain this." She sighed, picking up the contract and flipping through it like it was nothing. For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. But then it was gone. "It was just a precaution," she said smoothly. "Nothing personal." I let out a harsh laugh, shaking my head. "Not personal?" I repeated. "You were planning to own me, Celine." She scoffed. "You always overreact." I gritted my teeth. "Number?" I was blind, but not anymore. Celine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So what now? You storm in here, yell at me, and expect what? An apology?" I pulled out another folder and placed it next to hers. Her confidence faltered. "What's this?" she asked, voice quieter now. I smirked. "A little something I put together. Legal documents exposing your family's shady business dealings, tax fraud, insider trading, money laundering." Her fingers curled against the desk. "You wouldn't." I leaned in. "Watch me." For the first time, real fear flickered in her gaze. I straightened, adjusting my jacket. "You tried to trap me, Celine. Now let's see how you like it when the tables turn." I turned and walked out, leaving her frozen in place. The moment I stepped outside, my phone buzzed. A message from Ronan. "You started a war, brother. You ready to finish it?" I exhaled slowly. There was no turning back now. This time, I wasn't just fighting to leave. I was fighting to win. I barely got 3 hours of sleep before my phone started buzzing. Not just one call, dozens, missed calls, messages, notifications stacking up like a digital avalanche. Something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and blinked at the screen, my vision still groggy. Then I saw it. My name was trending. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I clicked on the top headline. "Scandalous allegations surround former fiancé of Cellini Drayton." My breath came slow and sharp as I read through the article. the false narrative. They painted me as an unstable, bitter ex who couldn't handle Celine moving on. They twisted past events, making it seem like I had financial troubles, that I had depended on the Drayton family's support to maintain my career. Even my work as a defense attorney wasn't safe. They hinted at unethical behavior, vague enough to avoid outright defamation, but damaging enough to raise doubt. But the final line, that final goddamn line, burned hotter than anything else. Perhaps Cassian Vane was never worthy of the Drayton legacy. I tightened my grip on my phone, my jaw clenching so hard I thought my teeth might crack. They were trying to erase me, again. I barely had time to process it before my firm called. They placed me on leave pending review. Clients stopped returning my calls. My inbox was flooded with cold, professional, "We regret to inform you" messages. This wasn't just retaliation. This was annihilation. I stared at my screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then Ronan's voice came through the line. "They're burying you, Cass. No greeting, no hesitation, just rage. You have to hit back, hard." I let out a slow breath, my anger simmering just below the surface. I know. Because this wasn't just an attack on my reputation. This was war. I spent the next 12 hours gathering everything I had. Emails, financial records, every single piece of dirt I had on the Draytons. If they wanted a public battle, then they were about to get one. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. The journalist answered on the second ring. "This better be good, Vane." I smirked. "Oh, it is." Then I sent over everything. By nightfall, new headlines started flooding in. The Draytons' dirty secrets, have they gone too far? Money laundering, corruption, and lies. The truth behind the Drayton empire. It was everywhere. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about clearing my name. This was about taking them down. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I picked up. A familiar voice spoke, low and sharp. "You have no idea what you've just done," I smirked. "Oh, I think I do." The line stayed open, silence stretching between us. I leaned back in my chair, waiting. A slow inhale on the other end. Then, finally, "Cassian?" Her voice, Celine. I closed my eyes briefly, exhaling. I had expected this. Maybe not this soon, but it was inevitable. Still, I let the silence hang before I answered, my voice cold. "What do you want?" She hesitated. When she spoke again, her tone was different. Not sharp, not condescending. Software, uncertain. "Cassian, I just wanted to talk." I let out a humorless chuckle. "Now you want to talk?" She didn't react to the bite in my voice. "I never meant for things to go this far," I scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" A sigh. "I don't know what I expect. I just want to see you. No games, no family, just us. One last time." I clenched my jaw, staring at my reflection in the window. I should have hung up. But against my better judgment, I found myself saying, "Fine." We met at a quiet rooftop lounge overlooking the city. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, tired, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. I slid into the seat across from her, watching as she lifted her gaze to mine. For the first time in years, there was no calculation in her expression, just something raw. "What happened to us?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "You tell me." She played with the rim of her glass, her gaze distant. "My family always told me who I should be with," she admitted. "Who would fit, who would make sense." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "You weren't their first choice, but I fought for you." My fingers curled against the table. "Fought for me?" I repeated. "Celine, you spent years tearing me down." She flinched but didn't argue. "I don't know if I loved you," she said quietly, "or if I loved what I thought you could become." The words settled between us, heavier than anything she had ever said before. For the first time, I saw it, the real Celine. Not the flawless socialite, not the cold manipulator, just a woman who had spent her life trying to be exactly what her family expected. "You could have chosen me," I said, voice steady. I saw the slight tremor in her hands as I spoke. "But you didn't." I exhaled. "And I finally understand that I was never the one who wasn't worthy." Selena reached for my hand across the table. a silent plea. I stared at it. Then, slowly, I pulled away. "This chapter is over, Celine." Her breath hitched, but she nodded once. I stood up, and this time, when I walked away, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking towards something better. The cool night air greeted me as I stepped onto the street. My phone buzzed. A text from Ronan. "So, is the war over?" I smirked, typing my response. "Yeah." And I won. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, exhaling slowly. The city stretched before me, lights flickering against the dark skyline. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. No whispers in the back of my mind. No expectations dragging me down. Just me, and I felt free. The final severance came 2 days later. A thick manila envelope sat on my desk, Drayton legal insignia stamped across the front. Inside, the last remaining ties to Seleni's world. A formal statement confirming my removal from all business dealings connected to their family. A signed release preventing them from interfering with my name, my career, my life. A clean break. I grabbed a pen and signed without hesitation. As I set the pen down, I smirked. They thought they could erase me, but in the end, I was the one who left them behind. That night, Ronan dragged me out to celebrate. "Here's to finally getting rid of the Draytons," he said, raising his glass. I clinked mine against his. "Took me long enough." For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone else was deciding my future. No battles to fight, no debts to settle, just possibilities. As I scanned the bar, my gaze landed on a woman across the room. She was laughing, completely unfiltered, a spark of life in her eyes that felt real. Nothing like Celine, no careful poise, no calculated movements, just herself. She caught me looking and smiled, genuine, open. I could have walked over right then, but I didn't, not yet. Because for the first time, I wasn't searching for something. I was enjoying the moment. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city. I looked up at the sky, at the endless stretch of stars above. I thought about the years I spent trying to earn love, trying to fit into someone else's version of me. Then, finally, the truth settled in my chest, light and undeniable. I was never unworthy. I was just with the wrong person. I smiled to myself, turning off my phone. An unread message from Selene sat at the top of my notifications. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. As I stepped into the street, I whispered to no one but myself. Not my story anymore. Sometimes losing everything isn't the end. It's the beginning. I spent years trying to fit into a life that was never meant for me. But the moment I stopped proving my worth to the wrong people, I found myself. We are never defined by those who walk away, but by the strength we find when we stand on our own. And if you've ever felt unworthy, let me remind you, you are enough. You always were. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the best stories are the ones we write for ourselves.